Greetings. My name's John Duvall. Welcome to another Truth Factor discussion. Yes, we're doing our best to start on time today. Depending on what time zone you're in, we might even be ahead of schedule. It's good to have everyone with us today. We appreciate you taking your time to join us for this period of studying the Bible, of factoring the Word into our daily lives. You will notice that we finally have our overlays working. We'd given up on them some months back because the Google Hangouts was just as finicky as all get out. But we discovered last week, hey, it looks like they're all going to work. Brian, doesn't that make you happy out there in Portland, Oregon?
I cannot describe the emotions that are coursing through me at this moment.
Well, assuming they're good emotions, are you doing all right today?
We're doing great out here.
Good, good. Let's see. Eric, how are you doing today?
The bottom third of me is feeling great here on this program, so it's doing good.
Okay.
Very clear and very readable. Let's see. How about you, Mike? How are things in your neck of the woods?
Excellent. Good to be home after a week's gospel meeting. I apologize for last week, but there are some areas of the country where the internet just doesn't work correctly.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. That's
But
right. Yeah, we hated it.
Home, it seems to be doing fine.
It just died out. Let's see.
You got all.
Paul, how about you?
I'm sorry, John?
How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. Certainly glad that you're all ready to study and that we can open up God's Word in the book of 1 Peter. I will mention before we get started that if you would like to participate, maybe you never joined the chat before, that in the chat window below there's a place to sign in, and you can just sign in as a guest. You don't have any special credentials you need. Type in your name, and it will let you then make comments and ask questions during our study. And we try to bring those in particular if they're pertinent questions to the study. How about you, Wayne?
Oh, I'm doing very well. I'm looking forward to our study today.
All righty. Well, let's go ahead and drop our lower thirds now. We'll bring them up as we close our study. Let's go ahead and continue with our study this morning. We left off last week in 1 Peter. We were in chapter 3 and had studied down to about verse 7. It is interesting, and you know, to be honest, I had not thought a lot about the context of Peter through the years. You know, whenever I would cover the passages such as verses 8 through 12. You know, 8 through 12 is a very easy passage to use as an idea for a sermon, and a lot of great points in there. But when you step back and look at the context of it, it's not simply a passage about how to love life and see good days. It's how to love life and see good days when you're dealing with those who are persecuting you, when you're dealing with those situations that is considered unjust suffering because you're a child of God. And if we look at it within the context of it, then it really presents, I think, a greater challenge to us to make use of it, not in the easy times only, but also in the most difficult times. Any thoughts or comments about that while I get to that passage so we could read it?
Well, Peter deals with our the nature of people, and that is that sometimes when we've had a bad day or things are just going really bad for us, and here that's a huge understatement, as they were preparing to deal with great persecution, that when things are really hard for us, it's easy for our disposition to become contrary, difficult to get along with, that we take our frustration out on others, and so when we see that here he's reminding them that in the face of all these things, remember your hope that you have, and remember that you need one another. Those are two themes throughout this book.
That's a good point. Good point. Any other thoughts?
Let's
go ahead and read verses 8. I'm going to go ahead and read verses 8 through 17. There seems to be a break around verse 13, but I think if we read verses 8 through 17, it'll help to keep the passage within the more immediate context there. And Wayne, let's see, what translation do you read from?
Today I'm reading from the New American Standard.
All right, let me get this. Bear with me just a moment. My secondary computer dropped the call here. And let's see. Back in the room. Let me share this. And whenever you're ready, Wayne, we'll read 8 through 17.
All right. To sum up, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. For the one who desires life, to love and see good days, must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. He must turn away from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. Do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence, and keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. For it is better, if God should will it so, that you suffer for doing what is right, rather than for doing what is wrong.
Okay. All right, well, I apologize for the sharing there. For some reason, I'm having trouble holding the connection with the second computer, and it's dropped me from the network as well. I've got to work around. We'll tend to that here in just a moment. So let's go ahead and take a moment here, back up then to verse 8. In the context of this, guys, he says, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do you think verse 9, when it says, do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, is really the phrase that helps to anchor this within the context of unjust suffering in our lives as Christians? Even at the hands of other Christians?
It may be, John, that there, as he gives those instructions, be of one mind, have compassion, love one another, love his brothers, be tenderhearted, be courteous. And then he says these things. It may be that sometimes he's calling upon them to have some understanding with one another. That just as I mentioned a moment ago, that when things are really bad in your life, it may be easy for you to take that out on them. That when someone does something that's uncharacteristic of a Christian, that maybe what you should do is step back and say, what's going on that might cause them to act in such an uncharacteristic way.
Okay.
And then it also seems like, you know, the two contexts, you know, looking at this unjust suffering, the immediate one was a husband who doesn't obey, and in the previous chapter it was a master and a government that we must submit to. And so in some ways it may be that the persecutor is not a fellow believer, and I almost picture verse 8, you know, describing the brothers being kind of locked arm in arm as they struggle together and face these things. So they're going to support and encourage and be sympathetic and you know, be unified in how they face the difficulty that's coming.
Okay. So maybe not necessarily facing it from other Christians, but just in general holding together as we behave properly when we face persecution.
Well, definitely Paul's point is true as well. I mean, if it is coming from a brother, we need to have this kind of heart, and you know, Paul deals with that in Ephesians 4. If we have how we maintain unity, it requires a lot of these same characteristics. So it applies. I think both applications would be true.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts or comments?
One thing we can't ignore is what Peter said previously in chapter 2 when he's talking about the example of Jesus. Jesus was someone who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. In 2:23 it says, while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And then just a few verses later, you know, Peter writes that you are not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. there's a very close connection between those things, and we can't allow the fact that one's in chapter 2 and one's in chapter 3 to obscure the fact that he wants us to see those ideas together. That the way Jesus acted on the cross in terms of not returning the insults, not reviling back at people who were reviling him, not insulting people who were insulting him, that's the same kind of evil for evil, insult for insult idea that we need to avoid as well. It can be very easy to try to one-up somebody, and even more so when we feel like we're morally justified in it, or like, well, they wronged me, so I need to put them in their place. But the reality is that nobody was more justified to hurl insult for insult than Jesus did. And yet Jesus, on the cross, uttered no threats. He just trusted himself to the righteous judge. And in the same way, we too, he says, don't return evil for evil, give a blessing instead, so that you can inherit a blessing. Now that's a hard thing to do. That's a hard idea to really follow. So much of our culture around us, I think, just wants to tell us, you can't let people push you around. You can't let people take advantage of you. You can't let people have the last word. And yet, those are all precisely against the kind of ideals that Jesus lived by. It really ought to give us pause when we start buying into those types of worldly philosophy.
Okay. All right. And I think as we hit verse 10 and some of the very specifics there, that'll really help build upon that.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts? Hey, Wayne, could you show us that one dress and shirt to the back that's got the yellow and brown pattern on it? I'd like to see that.
Oh boy. Well, we'll save that for another time. We won't use the study to make merchandise. I just happen to be on a different computer that happens to be located in my wife's in-home clothing store.
Call a free advertisement on the Truth Factor Live network.
Yeah, free advertising. I hadn't intended that, but yeah, that's what's.
Your room is full of external adornments, I notice.
Yeah, that's true. I guess this wouldn't have really fit well last week with the when we were talking about the merely external adornments. They're all modest clothes, by the way. Not modest in the sense that Peter describes them, but modest in the sense that we would think they're not very revealing.
Yep. Well, so we understand verse 8, have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, a humble mind. I really believe we've started a study on Sunday mornings here called Attitudes and Reactions to Congregational Problems by Glenn Barnhart. It's a really good study. And it seems some of the greatest problems that happen within local congregations center around a lack of humility and a lack of sympathy and brotherly love. But kind of going back to what Eric was saying, and then to help solve problems, as Paul was pointing out, with these qualities, it helps to stitch us together and will respond properly and not aggravate the situation. You think about road rage for a minute. Oftentimes, road rage could be calmed down or extinguished if just one person would choose to just be kind and apologetic and not be the one of confrontation there. Let's see. When he says, therefore, to this you were called, talking about to bless, that's our responsibility. That's our lot in life when we're dealing with those who have mistreated us. And the end result is we'll be blessed when we do that. Part of the blessing, I think, might be seen in verses 10 through 12. Any thoughts before we kind of look at that?
John, I was just going to mention that. Oh, go ahead, Eric. I apologize.
No, Paul, go. You're sure.
Very briefly, I was just going to mention that here he gives, it's not just don't lose your temper, but instead make sure that you are actively blessing. You're actually providing something positive by that I don't mean getting into the all positive preaching question, all that. I just mean that you're contributing something helpful. Not just refraining from saying something hurtful, but you are doing something helpful. And I was just going to say that he puts the responsibility both ways there. I apologize, Eric. I kind of jumped on your words. Go ahead.
No, I think we both started at the same time. Thank you, Paul. I think it's interesting. He says, don't do this, but do this because this is what you were called to. The don't do part is repaying evil for evil, and it's clear in other passages in the Bible that God is the judge, and in fact, in the passage that was just it was just referenced a moment ago by Wayne, that Jesus was entrusting himself to God, and God is the one who will repay people and will punish. But sometimes we want to help him out with that. We want to make sure that someone suffers when they have been unjust or when they've done the wrong thing, and we want to. But that's not what we're called to do. And what we're called to do is a much more difficult thing. But what we're called to do is bless those who curse you, and that's very difficult. If we need a little motivation, then he says, and when you do that, you'll receive a blessing. That leads into what you're about to say, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
John said something that kind of struck me, talking about road rage situations where, it would be nice if just one person would apologize, it would diffuse the whole thing. But what's the biggest obstacle to people apologizing? The number one excuse people give for why they won't apologize is because, I do not believe I've done anything wrong. I do not believe I have anything to apologize for. And that's and I've never met anybody who genuinely, refusing to apologize, who genuinely thought, well, I have something to apologize for, but I'm just not going to do it. That never happens. What happens is, no, people just don't believe they've done anything wrong. They're going to stick to their guns, and they're going to fight it out. And you know what? It doesn't matter. Even if you haven't done anything wrong, you need to de-escalate the situation before it goes crazy and out of hand. There are some battles that just aren't worth what they will cost you to win them. It's you might win the argument, but you lose your soul in the process. You lose a relationship with a person. You lose someone else's soul in the process. Was it really worth it to win the argument? Was it really worth it to be right? And that's coming from somebody who really likes being right all the time. But at the end, there's some things in life are more important than being right, depending on the situation.
That's right.
Sometimes it's more important to be rightly related.
You're right about that, Wayne.
That's a great comment.
A number of years ago, I was in the car picking up one of my kids from school, and a fella came flying around us. I mean, nearly clipped us when he got over. And I kind of threw my hands up in, just exasperation. Well, out of the corner of his eye in the rearview mirror, it looked like I threw up more than just my hands in exasperation. The fella followed me to the house and got out of his car when I got home. And although in my mindset he was completely in the wrong, I knew the situation had to be scaled down pretty quick. And he got out of the car ready for some sort of physical engagement. And the way that I calmed the situation down is I took responsibility. I shouldn't have reacted that way. And once he calmed down, then we could reasonably talk about it. And we started talking about neighborhood, neighbors, and everything such as that and all that. But all I would have had to have said is, you idiot, you were in the wrong. You shouldn't have done that. And it would have got worse pretty quick. We need to be willing to say, hey, I had a part in this. I apologize for that. Now, there are going to be times, though, that you may be completely innocent. And I still agree with what you say, Wayne. Even if you're completely innocent, if it means throwing cold water on some fire, you want to take responsibility to some level, and not try to escalate the situation even further. Whether we're talking about road rage or just misunderstandings or any situation in our lives as Christians. Not to ramble much farther, but Romans chapter 12, 9 through 21 is a great passage for this. But think about where it says, as much as lies with you, live at peace with all men. We do the best that we can. Sometimes it's not enough.
Sorry, John. Sometimes I think the idea, too, is that we feel like we wouldn't be doing an accurate defense of things if we do submit. I was thinking of Paul back whenever he is defending himself before the Sanhedrin. The priest orders someone to strike him. He responds, I think, out of a bit of anger and a bit, an understandable anger. And of course, everybody says you're going to talk that way to the high priest. And Paul backs down right away. I could see from Paul's perspective, he might have been thinking, if I back down, it's going to look like I'm wrong on this very important spiritual point. But he still does. He still says, you know what, I shouldn't have said something about the leader because the scriptures say not to say it. I would have been tempted to say, you know what, I don't want to back down because you're in the wrong and this is an important point. But even on an important point, in order to make peace, he backed off.
Yeah. I mean, Paul had the knowledge to say, your position no longer exists anymore. I no longer have to respect your position. Mosaical law was then.
Well, you know what? And what he accused the high priest of is the same thing Jesus did in Matthew 23.
That's a good point.
That's a good point. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There you go.
All right. Any other thoughts or comments? Let's look at the quote from Psalms. Your footnote probably says cited from Psalms 34:12 through 16, starting there with verse 10 of our text. And he says, for whoever, and this is the English Standard Version, for whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Now, unrelated to the term evil, I do need to make mention that Tom is not with us today. He had a previously scheduled appointment, and I don't want Tom to think that we didn't miss him because we didn't mention him. We do miss you, Tom, and sorry you weren't able to be here with us today. Looking at the text here, we've got a couple of things. First off, whoever desires to love life and see good days. One might say from a sermon standpoint, that's where it all begins. But the method whereby this is done is you keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Now, let's pause there for a moment. Peter's making application of this within this context. So are we to look at this and kind of keep it limited to the context, and in that, in our response to other people when we are mistreated, we keep our tongues from evil, we keep our lips from deceit, we turn away from evil behavior, and we do good? I mean, there's the broader application, obviously, but do you think that we need to really focus on this from the standpoint of how we deal with those who might persecute us?
In other words, you're saying maybe the original context of this was a very broad application towards what we call a truism, that if you want to have a good life in this world, you do this. But now Peter's making the application, or using this passage to make a very specific application. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
I think Psalm 34 as a whole is kind of hovering in the background of several things Peter says, but this is the part where he actually comes out and quotes it. But there's a point earlier in Psalm 34:8, for instance, where he says, taste and see that the Lord is good, how blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. And Peter kind of alluded to that back in chapter 2 and verse 3, where he talks about tasting the kindness of the Lord. And another thing that comes to mind, just the whole message of Psalm 34 is about, you need to trust in the Lord to deliver you. You need to trust in the Lord, stop trying to do stuff yourself. And later on, 1 Peter 4:19, those who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. Over and over again, there's this exhortation in Psalm 34: trust in the Lord, because He actually will save His servants. And Peter, I think, is poking and prodding at different ideas in that psalm throughout. You might ask the question, well, the Lord saves His servant. What if they get killed? What if something bad happens? And Peter kind of throws that in verse 13 of chapter 3. Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for doing what is good? What are we going to do about that? Well, the Lord still secures His servants. He still protects them. In Psalm 34, verse 20, He keeps all His bones. Not one of them is broken, which, we think of that as talking about, Jesus on the cross and not having His bones broken. But there's an application to the believer as well, in the sense that, ultimately, even if the flesh is destroyed, even if the body is removed, what is inside, what is substantial, gets preserved, it's not broken, and it's brought back. And so you kind of have a resurrection allusion in there as well. So there's a lot in that psalm that I think is relevant for reading 1 Peter.
I think that's an interesting point, Wayne, and it fits with something I was just questioning in my mind about how active God is in this, and the idea of blessing and cursing. I'd really like to, I guess, ask this more as a question to the group as more than anything. But do we imagine this idea of being a blessing along the lines of, if you follow these instructions, things will just go better for you as a general fact of how relationships work, which we could see the truthfulness of that as in many of the wisdom literature, or do we? It almost seems like the idea of a blessing invokes that God takes note of this and will cause good things to happen in an more active sort of way than as opposed to just let me tell you how you can avoid conflict with other people. But in that, if you will submit to this, that God will see to it that you are blessed as a result. Do you guys understand it that way?
I think both are true in this passage. If I'm understanding correctly, Eric, the loving life and seeing good days. You're going to have a more pleasant life if you don't speak evil. If you don't, if you're not a deceptive person, always trying to cover something up or lying. And to seek evil and pursue it, to turn away from evil, to seek good, and to seek peace and pursue it. But then he reminds in the Psalm, the quote from the Psalm, verse 12, the Lord's watching, and he provides blessing, and he listens, and he's the one that you can turn to. And so I really think there's both ideas there.
Something I noticed in verse 9 of 1 Peter 3, he says, "You not return evil for evil, insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead." And this whole time I've been sitting here reading it as if, talking about blessing those who are persecuting us. But he doesn't ever specify an object. He doesn't specify who we're supposed to be blessing. And I wonder if, again, thinking in the context of the Psalm, what's the first thing he says in Psalm 34? Psalm 34, verse 1, "I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth." And for that matter, it's how Peter started the letter. "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ," which, I think they're actually even the same word in the Septuagint. So it is kind of interesting, instead of returning evil to others, bless the Lord. And, if his praise is in your mouth and, your focus is on him and what he's doing, then what other people do to you just kind of becomes irrelevant. So I'm wondering if that idea might be there.
Well, let's add a third, if I may.
Yeah.
Throughout 1 Peter thus far, Peter has shown us that the object is to be as much like Christ as possible. It says in the second chapter, that Christ left us an example that we should follow his steps.
Mm-hmm.
What better life than the life of Christ? So read verse 10 this way. "He that will love Christ and see the greatness of his life, let him refrain his tongue from evil, his lips that they speak no guile. Let him turn from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and ensue it, just as Christ did in every object of his life." Jesus did not return railing for railing. Back in chapter 2, when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not. He committed himself to him that judges righteously. Well, that's verse 12. The eyes of the Lord are over the righteous. His ears are open unto their prayers. Certainly God rewarded Christ with all that he could possibly give him, and yet the face of the Lord was against them that do evil. Look how God punished those that punished his son.
Huh?
Good point.
Wayne, whether or not Peter had in mind blessing the particular person who curses you, we know that was also taught by Jesus as well as Paul. And
Right. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse.
Right.
I know. I'm just trying to think what Peter was. And he may mean both. He may be deliberately ambiguous by leaving out an object, but I just thought that was interesting.
Wayne has said enough to cause me to really rethink it.
I'm done.
I intentionally dramatically paused there to cause me to rethink a few things. Let me talk a little bit for a moment about the blessing thought. When you read it, do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary. So instead of repaying evil, instead of reviling, what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Wayne put forth the idea of you bless the Lord. Well, I've always read it as, well, you bless the person who's persecuting you. So what are you going to do? The person is slapping you or beating you. You turn around and say, hey, I like your haircut. Or, hey, you've got a good family lineage there. How do you speak well of someone Because is that not the idea of blessing? To in some ways, in this context, we bless the food. That is, we thank God, speak favorably of it. How do you bless someone through the spoken word that is setting they're punishing you? But what if instead of yelling back at them and telling them that they are the scum of the earth, you simply turn and thank the Lord for what He's given you? I mean, I hadn't really considered it, but how would you bless someone who is persecuting you?
Well, connecting that with the blessing your
intended
food, when Jesus talks about, he gave a blessing for the food, we also see that it means He gave thanks for it. But also tying all that together, Jesus also said when someone persecutes you, pray for those who do that. So even if you don't address your thoughts to the persecutor, you could pray to God on that person's behalf, and that would also be very scriptural concept. And that would be a blessing.
In a way, that's a way of calling blessing for them.
Right.
I mean, we talk about blessing someone.
And Paul said to the Romans that in so doing you heap coals of fire on their head. And some of us have, as we say, been there, done that. When you do good to those that do evil to you, when you turn right around and say, I sure hope God helps you understand, it just lights their fire a little bit more. But yet you have investing toward them. There's never any harm in doing good. And there's always harm in doing something wrong. Even in our speech, you got to learn to read people too. But a lot of times, it's best just to say nothing and take the offense. A little while ago, I was remembering what Paul said about being sued at the law. Did he not tell Corinth, go ahead and take it? Take it and bear that infirmity and take the fault. Sometimes it's just best that we act more like Christians instead of. The Lord said vengeance is His, and I believe at times we become guilty of being thieves by saying, okay, I'll get even with you. That's not ours to do.
I was looking at some of the passages where a number of the passages, you guys have already mentioned a couple of them, where we're told to bless those who persecute us. And I was looking at one of Paul's statements in 1 Thessalonians 5:15. He says, instead of saying bless them, he says, pursue what is good for yourselves and for all. And I can't help but to wonder if maybe that is the best definition of what we're saying of how to respond to this. Pursue what is best for everybody, which of course we'd say is peace, which may be, but it may be saying nothing, or it may be correcting somebody. It just may be specific to the circumstance. But whatever it is, it's whatever's for the best for them.
Because Jesus was not blessing those people who were scourging Him. I mean, you think about everything He went through. At what point did He turn around and say something nice?
Forgive him.
And that's that prayer.
Well, I mean, we don't want to be too rigid with our definition of blessing. Blessing isn't just paying someone compliments, although it can mean that. Blessing can be just a way of simply calling down favor from above on someone. And you could argue that Jesus did that when He prayed, that God for God to forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. So that's a possibility as well.
Which God could not do until they obeyed Him on Pentecost.
There's a sense in which what Jesus does on the cross blesses everybody who sins against Him in that instance. He did give a blessing. It was a very different kind of blessing.
I guess I'd kind of go back to what Brian said, maybe from what Paul wrote to the Thessalonian brethren. I mean, there are some times where someone, like Mike pointed out from Romans chapter 12, someone will be mean to you, and then they're going to find themselves in need, and you're going to be there to help them. That's kind of the idea there. If your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. But then there may be times where you don't have the opportunity to do anything for them. Just how do you respond to what they have done to you? Maybe what Brian said, the best response is what's going to be good for everybody, what's going to bring about the peace. So sometimes you say nothing until at the end, like Jesus said, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. But I'm still struggling though. I guess then what Wayne was talking about earlier, it could be viewed either way. How do you respond to the person who has treated you with evil? or who has reviled you, you don't respond in kind, but instead you respond in opposite, even if that includes praying to the Lord on their behalf. Interesting. Interesting. And the other one, other thing you said, Wayne, had to do with about the whole context of Psalms 34, being kind of maybe a possible underlaying layer here to what Peter is talking about. And I think it's worthy of further study and looking at that a little bit more so. All right. Any other thoughts or comments, though?
Sometimes I think this. Well, and I'm thinking about my own question, I guess. Even in this, my wife has asked me this. Like, so you pray for something. How does God answer that? That's that great mystery that maybe we don't really understand, and it may have to do with this cursing and blessing. I've even wondered, when Jesus sent him out and he said, "Let your peace remain on the house," or "Take your peace with you." What does all that mean? But I think it goes back to it, maybe even in that psalm that Wayne keeps alluding to. If we trust in the Lord and we trust in His, care, and we trust in this statement in verse 12 that His eyes are on the righteous, that we don't have to know how He's going to bring these blessings about, or how He's going to do what He says we do. It's both down to faith. I guess that's me answering myself, I guess.
I got some of that.
That was easy. That was easy for you to say.
Yeah.
I mean, it was
your voice
more
has become
understandable, though. Yeah, it's more understandable than normal, though. And it may be something that we can't answer. And the very question that you and your wife talking about regarding prayer and how does the Lord answer, Ron and I have had similar discussions about that. And we don't always see eye to eye on it. I'm a little more... I don't know. I want to see more scripture, but it's interesting. And any thoughts about what Eric said?
I'm still trying to sort it out in my head. All right.
Eric, that was in context with what we were talking about as far as how we bless others. And maybe when we pray for others who have done us wrong?
Well, and in just the idea of receiving a blessing, and all the way down to verse 12, that the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous and His ears are open to their prayer. In all of this blessing and cursing and all that, it's how active, and I think we just don't know how God works about, how He brings about the blessings, how He answers those prayers. I don't know that we can know that.
Yeah.
I also noticed something in connection. I mean, I also noticed that, the quote falls back to verse 7 as well. You treat your wife as in an understanding way so that your prayers will not be hindered. Why? Because the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous. His ears attend to their prayer. And if your relationship with your wife doesn't fit that, then He's not going to listen to your prayer. He's going to set His face against you. You'll be considered an evildoer. So there's that aspect of it as well.
And if we react evil for evil, and we scratch someone's car because they scratched our car, we've sinned. And it'll hinder our prayers unto the Lord as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, any other thoughts or comments on verses 10 through 12, or anything we've talked about so far?
I do like to point out sometimes that I think it's interesting that the desire to love life and see good days is not a bad thing, that God intends for His people to enjoy this experience, and to some degree at least, it's I think sometimes we can become almost fatalistic, or I don't know what the right word is, but just sort of assume this idea that we're supposed to just be downtrodden and suffering, but it's the Lord's intention that His people are blessed in this life, even here and now, not only in the next life, but we can enjoy this life. That's okay.
That's a good point.
I still think that our question, and I'm not sure if we really answered it too well or not earlier, about what exactly does this seeing good days about? Is it the spiritual forward, which I think is what Peter might be looking for, but I don't think that's what David was talking about when he originally said it. I think David was talking about the life here now, and I think that we already said it earlier. We said, that generally speaking, whenever you are a person of peace, you tend to live in peace.
Well, I mean, you got a lot of things in the Psalms like this, actually. It's like in Psalm 16 where David says, "You will not abandon my soul into Sheol, nor allow your Holy One to undergo decay." I mean, when he said that, was he just basically thinking, you're not going to let me die? That seems to be the gist of it. But the apostles clearly used that passage to talk about something bigger.
Right.
Right, the resurrection of the dead.
Right. Well,
I mean, you might got a similar thing going on with Psalm 34. Exactly how much David knew about his words meaning more than most people would have suspected, I couldn't tell you. That's the Lord's end of the stick, I guess.
And Wayne, Psalm 34 is interesting because at the end of Psalm 34, David is talking about the righteous being protected, and he says their bones won't be broken.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we go to John 19, and we're told, well, that's actually about Jesus. Well, Jesus was abused. I mean, it's clearly exactly not what David was saying. David was talking about how the righteous would be kept from harm, and of course, when that passage is applied in the prophetic mind, it's actually about a specific kind of harm that was brought to Jesus. So it's completely not the meaning of what David was saying.
Yeah, I mean, I argue again. Verse 20 finds its application in the resurrection as well. Not in the sense of literal bones not being broken. I mean, because somebody dies. Well, at least they didn't break any of his bones. It's just kind of a head scratcher. You think, well, what good is that if he's dead? But of course, John sees that fulfilled in a very literal way. But then there's a deeper meaning to that even when Jesus comes back from the dead, and you realize, okay, clearly death wasn't the end of him. They weren't able to destroy him. And of course then there's the Passover illusion as well, the fact that they aren't supposed to break bones of the Passover lamb. So there's all kinds of different things that come into there. It really makes for a great sermon topic, but it's exploring all of the directions you can take that.
John, it seems that...
Oh, go ahead, Paul. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it seems that, once again, Peter likes to repeat things and make a different point about he's teaching the same principle, make a different point about it. We saw that with all the submissive things. Here we see this. I was looking at the as we continue on down through our reading about who will harm you if your followers what is good. Even if you suffer for righteousness' sake, you're blessed. Do not be afraid of their threats. So he's telling them once again how to deal with that situation, but then what you're to do. Sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason, the hope that's in you with meekness and fear. And he goes on. And so it seems like, once again, he has that same thing, not reviling, not answering again, not insulting, I think was one of the translations there, and accept suffering if that's what you have to endure. But there's a blessing that you can provide. Certainly, praise to God. But here, to tell them why you are truly suffering. Recently, we were studying about in our Bible class here at Ellettsville. We're studying about Paul's defense. I think it was before Agrippa, and in the Bible class, and looking at that, and he says the reason that he talked about the hope that the Jews had in the prophecies of the Old Testament. He says, that's the very reason that I am standing before you now. I'm imprisoned, is for the hope of our fathers. And he identifies that as Christ. And so he stands before them as one who's accused, one who's condemned, although they couldn't find a reason to condemn him, one who's imprisoned. But in doing that, he says, well, here's the reason, and it's because I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he's the resurrected Savior. And he tells him about that, and he asks Agrippa, do you believe that? So I think that's the kind of thing that, once again, it's a cycle in the writing of Peter throughout this book of going through some of the same things and just emphasizing it, refocusing over and over again.
Well, I mean, they're going to be suffering here pretty soon, and someone will say, why are you a Christian? Or they need to be able to answer the question. Why are they taking it?
Why are you this way? Why are you so hopeful?
Right.
Yeah.
Because Jesus.
One thought on the word unbroken. We will sometimes use the term broken as in trying to break someone's spirit, or maybe under torture, they're trying to get someone to break. Jesus never did. He fulfilled his purpose all the way to the end, and that was fulfilling of his purpose. I don't know if that would, I know that's not the same idea of broken as we see in the scriptures, but you know, there is that interesting thought there that he never did break in what he was doing. Also in verse 10, I can also see as a very generalized statement, if you want to have a good life, here's the way you manage yourself even when you may be persecuted. But there could be a very spiritual aspect to Peter's use of it as well here. And Paul, I like what you said. We'll come back to that here in just a couple minutes. I think some good points there. But any other thoughts or comments on 10 through 12, or are we ready to segue on into 13 through 17 before we got about 12 minutes or so? Thoughts?
Ready for 13.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's interesting. He says, "Now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good?" What comes to my mind in that when I read that is the fact that Jesus says, "Don't fear those who can destroy the body, but fear him who can destroy the body and soul." No man can separate us from the love of Christ, Paul also writes. So would you say, verse 13, now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for good works? Is the harm there the full, complete destruction? Because he's about to talk about suffering for righteousness' sake.
I think he's saying in general, as in he says in Romans 13, basically, that if you do the right things, you really shouldn't have to worry about the government persecuting you. But he goes on to say, but even if you do suffer for righteousness' sake, and he says in verse 17, if that is the Lord's will that you do that. So it seems to be the possibility is you will suffer, even when you've done all these things that you're supposed to do. It may be that you will suffer, but I think that is the suffering or the harm that he has in mind there, just because he makes that contrasting statement in verse 14. We should live without fear, and we should assume that if we do the right thing, that the government's not looking to punish us, but it could be that they will.
The question in verse 13, if it's just by itself, somebody might have tried to accuse Peter of being naive, like, well, who's there to harm you if you prove zealous for the right thing? A lot of people, because a lot of people suffer for doing the right thing all the time. But verse 14 acknowledges, no, I do know that you're going to suffer, even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you're blessed. There's people are going to persecute the righteous. It's going to happen. But really, what's the worst they can do to you? Kill you? Well, if that's all they can do, well then no, they actually can't really harm you permanently. And that gets back to what you're saying. That destroying, they can only destroy your body. Big deal. The Lord's going to bring that back. And since the only person on earth that can truly hurt you and do significant damage to you is yourself, somebody torturing you isn't going to compel you to sin. So that I think it becomes the point here. There's no somebody might put a gun to your head, but there's no gun to your soul.
Right. All right, that's a good point.
But if you contrast that with Romans 13, Paul is specifically saying there that ideally, if you're doing the right things, you should not have to be afraid of the government. That's not the purpose of the government. And so if you do what's bad, then you should be afraid. But if you're doing the right things, then you should expect to receive. And maybe the point for us would be, like there's so many people that are so paranoid about the government, what they're up to and all that. But I think in general, if I'm doing the right things, I don't really have a reason to be afraid of the authorities. Now, could they persecute you? Yes, and I think that's what Peter mentions in 14 and following. It could be if that's the Lord's will, but in general, it's not the way it works.
I think that point is true. I'm just not sure 1 Peter and Romans 13 are saying the same thing, but I think the point is true. Just looking at the overall context of 1 Peter 3, I think he's thinking more big picture. Who is there to harm you ultimately in the long run? Don't fear their intimidation. Don't be troubled. Because it doesn't. I don't get the gist of that there's like some kind of systemic government persecution going on in the background of 1 Peter. I think what's more likely going on, especially when you read chapter 4, is these people in the community are looking at you like, what kind of a weirdo are you? You're not participating in all our drunken excesses and orgies and things like that. You're such and well, you don't worship the emperor? What's wrong with you? And so things like that would start to compound over time. And you might be saying, well, is doing the right thing worth it if all of my friends and my family are ostracizing me? And Peter says, well, really, who's going to hurt you? Really? Well, what if my neighbors hurt me? Well, so what? They can't really hurt you. That's the impression I get from 1 Peter 3, anyway.
I think the Romans 13 connection, Eric, comes in a few verses down when he says, "Let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, a busybody.
Right.
Nothing matters. If anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed." So I think there is a connection here that you can make some similar comparisons between what's being said in Romans 13 and what Peter's main thrust is in this section.
And maybe in this part that what Wayne's saying is more like a Romans 8. If God's for you, who can be against you? And it may be that in a broader sense. So I can see your point there.
Well, I mean, like you look at Jesus even. Jesus hadn't broken any laws, but people still harmed him, and the Jewish authorities came after him and they destroyed him, and the whole point comes up that, well, even though Jesus suffered, there was still glory to follow. The whole thing that Peter's constantly talking about, suffering first and then glory. Mm-hmm. And, somebody, after you've suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ Jesus, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. Chapter 5, verse 10. That whole idea, suffering comes first and then glory. Christ suffered unjustly, but he was glorified by God, vindicated by God. We're going to see in 3:18, he was put to death in the flesh, put to death by the flesh, made alive by the Spirit. The flesh killed him, but the Spirit brought him back to life as a way of God vindicating him.
Well, is it not the case here, gentlemen, that when we're looking at verses 13, actually down through the rest of the chapter, but down through 17, which we read, is it not the case that the suffering comes from that the imposement of the suffering comes from those people that oppose Christ? And therefore, when they oppose Christ, we take it personally. So therefore, we give them instead an answer for why we are what we are. We're happy, verse 14, to take that opportunity of adversity to tell them about Christ. Verse 15, we're happy for that opportunity to set Christ apart for a holy use in our hearts and give them a reason for our happiness and our hope. At verse 16, we rejoice in this fact that while their conscience speaks evil of us, our manner of life speaks well of us because it shows Christ, not mankind. It shows Christ in us, so that at verse 17, if we're suffering for if the will of God is that we suffer, we're suffering so that we can exemplify Christ, not ourselves. So it's all about preaching Christ in our marriages, in our individual lives, in our jobs, in our environment, in our congregations. I think Paul said it early on in this study. This entire book the entire letter is simply telling us, go ahead and accept what the world gives you and turn it to an opportunity of showing why Christ means all to us.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well
Brian,
said.
any thoughts?
We've already said it, but I'll say it. Remind us too. There is a context here. Well, it started with the government, and then it went to our masters or our employers. Then it went to our husbands and wives. And I don't really think we've left that context. I actually think that that's still the point of what he's talking about with suffering or all of these different things. I think, and I think everything that we've said really has kind of reminded us of that. But, again, we might remember this applies to the person who's married to somebody who makes them suffer, or the person who is working for somebody who makes them suffer, and that would be the context of these statements.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine saying that to who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? Can you imagine saying that to a woman who is in a relationship with a husband that is not understanding and not treating her right? That's
certainly not. Yeah, you're right. I mean, that would be a hard thing to say, but clearly that is what he's saying.
Yeah, I mean that's a real gut puncher there. But I think his point is ultimately, you can't control your circumstance, but you can control whether you do the right thing. So do the right thing.
But even the goal for the husband in verses 1 and 2 is they're going to see you doing what's good, they're respectful and pure conduct, and then ideally be won by that. And I would assume that would imply a ceasing of the persecuting or the suffering. So the goal still is, if you do what's right, hopefully that's going to lead to better days in the verse 10 sense. I still think this is talking about here and now. You follow the Lord and follow these instructions, and it is a path to a better life.
Yeah, I think we probably all know the stories of people who are in miserable marriages, and either we or somebody else gave them the advice to, do what the Lord says, and they come back and say, hey, suddenly my marriage turned around and I'm a lot happier. And I think that's true. But here's the thing: can we not say that the same would then be true of the work relationship or even a government relationship?
Sure. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, and even something that you have almost no control of, like, the government you're under, you still, so much of that is even just changing your outlook and changing the perspective, and stop making it about trying to fix things you can't change or complain about things you can't change, and make it more about, taking confidence in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and sanctifying him in your hearts and not fearing the intimidations or the conspiracy that they put forth. Peter alludes to a passage in Isaiah here that I think is so relevant for the time we live in, probably relevant for every time. In Isaiah 8 and verse 12, you are not to say it is a conspiracy in regard to all that this people call a conspiracy, and you are not to fear what they fear or be in dread of it. It is the Lord of hosts whom you should regard as holy, and he shall be your fear, and he shall be your dread. Which, interestingly, and Peter, instead of saying you regard the Lord of hosts as holy, he says regard Christ as Lord as holy in your heart. So kind of an implicit argument for the deity of Christ, even just in the way he substitutes that out. But what he says here, the world fears all kinds of stuff. You can just turn on cable news and you'll see the nonsense that people get worked up about. Everything is out to kill you. Everything is out to get you. People are going to come take your money away or take your rights away or violate all these different things. And, don't be afraid of that. It's all just chatter. It's a distraction from Satan. Focus on the thing that matters. Sanctify Christ as Lord. Make him your fear. If you're fearing something other than Christ, you're poisoning yourself. You're destroying, the hope that is within you rather than defending it. You can't let that happen.
Okay. All right. Good, wonderful thoughts, everybody. Any thought is there anything else through verse 17 that would do good to talk about next week, or should we plan to pick up with verse 18?
Let's start at verse 18.
18, okay. Because I'm sure we'll throw back to it in our discussion because there's a lot of interconnection there. But yeah, sound good to everybody?
Yes.
I preached a sermon this past Sunday night on the subject of suffering for Christ, and I'm going to share this with you, not because I find it to be great or outstanding, but this is just the way that I kind of concluded what Peter's talking about here. And the main point of the sermon is what should be our attitudes when we suffer, and showed that suffering for Christ is commendable. We need to remember that we should always respond with love, that it's better to suffer for good, and we're not alone, Jesus suffered for us, and that we should rejoice. Very simple, but I kind of think that's what we're looking at here when we look at the context of what he said. He's telling us how to respond and the attitudes that we should have when we suffer unjustly, when we suffer for doing that which is good. And it's good to remember that as we read through this, because who knows, we may hit a point in our life where we're having to go back to this text because without it we're going to lose our mind because we think the whole world is against us. So, all right, let's see. Okay, so let's go ahead, and I guess it's time we'll pull the study to a close and pick up next week with chapter 3, verse 18. Paul, you sent me a note. I'm not sure if we've had any technical issues. Please let us know. We definitely would like to know about that. Drop it in the chat room or email us if there's seemed to be any glitches in our stream today. But let's see. Let's go ahead and start with the final closing thoughts or comments. And Brian, since you're the first one with your overlay up that I saw, I'm going to let you go ahead and go first there.
No, just that what Peter has said here is a difficult part of being a Christian. As Jesus said right in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, learning to turn the other cheek. And it's something that doesn't come natural to us, and we have to work on, and yet it's where our blessings in this life and the next are going to be found.
That's a good point. Because ultimately it shows who we truly respect.
Right.
You think about it, yeah. All right, Eric, any final thoughts or comments?
I think we would all agree that in conflicts between humans, we can only control our half of the problem, and there's no guarantee that we can fix it, but we can probably be guaranteed that we could make it worse. And so there's a lot of instructions here that are hard to follow, but they're for our good if we will trust God and do what He says.
Good point. Good point. Mr. Mike, any final thoughts?
May you all live long and prosperous by being obedient. I thank you for the study. It's been a good one today.
Of all people to quote Star Trek, I didn't expect it to be Mike, but then he...
That's the only thing I know about it.
Paul, any final thoughts?
As we were studying along, we call this the truth factor discussion, and the idea is that we get together and started this study so that we could factor the truth into our daily lives. We could find points that we could apply each day in the way in which we live. And there were several today. In bad times, don't take it out on others. When others are having a hard time, assume the best of their actions. Never be harmful, always be helpful. Be humble enough to yield and apologize. Be ready to accept wrong. The way you treat others impact your relationship with God. And always be ready to tell others of your hope. Those were just a few of the ones that I found in our study today.
Excellent point. I appreciate it, Paul. Wayne, any final thoughts?
Oh, I think I've said enough. But actually, I enjoyed the study today, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to study with you all. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate what you said today, Wayne, as we appreciate everybody. Appreciate all of you. I mean, we missed Tom today, and Tom definitely would have had some good thoughts to have brought out during our study today, but we hopefully will see Tom next week. And we'd like to thank you for taking time to join us for this period of study. Remember everything that we've said, but more importantly, remember what the Word of God says, and make sure you are applying that in your life as you strive to be one of His faithful followers. Thank you so much for joining us. Lord willing, we will be able to resume our study next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
That's noon in the Eastern Time Zone.
9 a.m. Pacific Time.
10 a.m. in Alberta, Canada, which also happens to be Mountain Time.
Right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.